Well, good morning again, everybody. Welcome to Crossroads. I'm Reed Robinette. I'm the senior pastor here, and I want to really say thank you for coming out today. This is a great morning to be here. We're in week 2 of a message series called A Fork Stuck in the Road. And it's not about forks or roads in that sense. It's about life-changing encounters. The type of encounter that Jesus had with people in the New Testament. And at the outset, maybe that can seem a little bit generic. So we're going to talk about how Jesus changes people's lives. But there are two, I think, particularly interesting facets about all of the encounters that we're going to look at that at least makes me think that they're way more interesting than it might at first appear. The first is that the encounters that we're going to look at and that we've begun looking at last week are with the most odd group of people, the most unlikely group of people. In fact, they would have said, I am the most unlikely person to have the type of encounter that they actually had with Jesus. Now, we said last week, if you were here with us, that Jesus, who was the person who was the closest to God, who ever walked the planet, he said, I and the Father are one. That's pretty close. He, being closest to God, seemed to hang out with people who were the farthest from God over and over and over again. And it weirded people out in his day. Andy Stanley says it this way, that people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. And so the first thing that I think is really interesting about these encounters is that they are with the most unlikely people. But second, that they have the most surprising methodology to them. In other words, what Jesus does not often match what we see in our day as the method of people leading people to this life-changing encounter. That Jesus, it turns out, doesn't argue, debate, or prove he's right almost ever, and he's always right. If anybody's always right, it would have been Jesus, right? But he almost never cared that anybody knew he was right. What he did instead was Jesus had intensely personal, life-changing, eternity-altering conversations. He would just enter these conversations with people that would end up in this life-changing encounter, that would end up changing their lives, that would end up being a fork in the road, where they look back and they said, gosh, I was never the same after that encounter. And so last week, if you weren't here, we looked at an encounter that Jesus had with a woman at a well who thought that her past made it impossible for her to move forward. She thought that the shame of her past was going to keep her stuck there. And Jesus has this remarkably scandalous conversation with her. He's not even supposed to be talking to a woman like her. And she notices that. And he tells her that the shame of her past will not keep her from the love of her Savior. And her life has changed forever. So, and if you can relate to her and weren't here, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that message, because it's a message that could change everything for us. Well, this morning, I want to look at another encounter, another very unlikely conversation. And let's remember why we're doing it. We want to look at these because, number one, our mission as a church is to lead people to life-changing faith in Jesus Christ. And we want to do it like Jesus. We don't want to do it unlike Jesus. So when we do that, we want to learn how he did it. But second, and way more importantly, we want to have encounters with Jesus. Everyone in the room. Especially if you would put yourself in the category of the woman who you just saw here in the drama, who would say, I don't know if I fit here. Especially if you think you are the least likely person this morning to have an encounter with Jesus that changes anything. This story's for you. And that's what Levi said. Levi who? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to introduce you to him here this morning. Levi is a character in the New Testament, and we're going to watch his encounter with Jesus. I need to tell you about him, though, before we read about the encounter. Levi was a tax collector. I know this might seem odd to you, but back in his day, being a tax collector wasn't a really positive thing. Now, I know we might find that hard to believe, but go with me here. It was even worse than you think. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, oftentimes people were given different categories that they fit into, and two categories are mentioned together a lot. They are sinners and tax collectors. And you might say, well, sinners and tax collectors, why don't they just say sinners, no matter what flavor you are? And you might know this, or you might not, that the reason that they differentiate between sinners and tax collectors is because it was so despised to be a tax collector that the sinners were offended if you would call them a tax collector. I'm not kidding. So they were like, it's fine to call me a sinner, but don't you dare call me a tax collector, right? And before you get too judgmental, don't we all do that? Don't we create a hierarchy? And as long as you can find somebody that you're better than, then you feel okay about yourself, or you feel a little bit better about yourself. And we do it. So the big sins and little ones. Mine are the little ones. Yours are the big ones, right? And so we do the same thing. We say, well, sure, maybe I cheat on my taxes, but at least I don't embezzle money from my company. Or somebody else says, well, maybe I embezzle money from my company, but at least I don't cheat on my wife. And somebody says, well, I cheat on my wife, but you see where this is going? Right, and it always ends with Hitler, right? like that's and so what I want you to know is Levi, listen, Levi, he is the bottom rung. He can't find anybody. Hitler's not born yet, so he doesn't have anybody that he can go, at least that's it. So Levi is a tax collector. And Levi has a conversation with Jesus. Jesus is a rabbi. Now, rabbi and tax collector are about as opposite as you could possibly get. I mean, it sounds like a joke back in their day, right? A rabbi and a tax collector walked into a bar. And because they couldn't have been more opposite. In every conceivable category, they were diametrically opposed. Their priorities were opposite. Their morality was opposite. Their religious affiliation, their political leaning, everything. They were opposites, which then probably surprises no one when I tell you that most tax collectors did not sit around waiting for an encounter with a rabbi. Never crossed their mind. And most rabbis didn't walk around looking for tax collectors to start conversations with. But you might be surprised if I told you that Jesus is not most rabbis. And he stops and has a conversation with this tax collector named Levi. So that's what I want to share with you this morning. I want to share with you the story of Levi, especially if there's a little Levi in you. Especially if you've ever felt like you and the church crowd maybe are a little incompatible, especially if you've ever felt like an outsider when you walked into a church building, this one or another one. Especially if you would say about yourself, I'm the least likely person to have an encounter with God this morning. Then I want you to hear the story of Levi, because it's really the story of everybody. And it might actually be the story of you, and you weren't even aware of it. So we're going to talk about the story of Levi this morning. Now, it's found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to be reading some verses from there. But I need to tell you something about the Gospel of Matthew. It's actually the Gospel of Levi. Did you know that? So, in other words, Levi was his Hebrew name. And after he has this encounter with Jesus, he gets a new name. And his Greek name is Matthew. And so he likes to be called that name, and he wants to get rid of the other one. And maybe you can see why. And so I'm just going to call him Matthew, because I think that's what he wants. And so Matthew is writing about his own encounter with Jesus that changed everything. And it starts in Matthew chapter 9. He gets right to the point. Verse 9. He says, as Jesus went, I think it's interesting that it took him 9 chapters to get to his encounter with Jesus as he's writing this whole thing. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Now, you say, well, that's not much of a conversation. Let me unpack it for a second for you. It's amazing on the outset that Jesus stops to talk to the guy. And you got to imagine that if you're in the entourage that's following Jesus, the rabbi, and he stops to talk to the person in the tax collector booth that's, remember, the lowest rung on the ladder, that you imagine what's going to happen here is something like the religious insider is going to use the religious outsider as an example. He's about to say, see, fellas, see what I'm telling you? I warned you about this. If you don't behave and obey God, this could happen to you. Do you see that? You've heard people say stuff like that in the name of God. And that's what they expected Jesus to say. And so imagine their surprise when instead of pointing fingers and accusing and using him as an example, he said, hey, Levi, come follow me. Well, that's staggering in anybody's world. It's maybe more amazing in the first century rabbinical world of Jesus. Here's why. You have to know a little bit about their customs. See, Jewish school started when you were about 6 years old. From age 6 to around 12 or 13, you would, as a young Jewish child, go to school, and they only had one subject, Bible. Like, that was it. And so you would learn the Bible. You would actually memorize the Bible starting at about age 6. I thought this quote from a rabbi of that era was interesting. He said, under the age of 6, we do not receive a child as a pupil, but after age 6, accept him and stuff him with Torah like an ox. That great picture? The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. So starting at age 6, all the way up to age 12, all the Jewish kids would go and they would learn their Bible. Now, then they would have their bar, bat mitzvah, 12 or 13, something like that. And then at age 14, just the boys in their culture, the best of the best, would get invited to rabbi tryouts. Because that's the way you became one of the religious elite. You became a teacher, a rabbi. If you were the best of the best for those 6 or 7 years, then you got invited to try out with a rabbi. Now, the rest of them all went home and they learned their family trade, whether it was being a fisherman or a carpenter, or I guess a tax collector. I don't know if that was a family business or not, but you would go back and learn a trade. But the best of the best would attach themselves to a rabbi, and they would learn. And they would try out. And at the end of that process, the rabbi would pick the best of the best of the best to become a rabbi. Now, if you didn't get picked, you went on your way. And if you didn't make the cut in rabbi tryouts, you would be sent home. And so that's where we find Matthew sitting at the tax collector. But he has not made it. But do you know what they would say to the pupils who made it, who were the cream of the crop, whom they were being invited to be a rabbi? They would say these words, come follow me. Lekacharai. That's what they would say. And that meant you have what it takes. I think you can be used by God. I think you can be like me. And so that's what a rabbi would say to the best of the best of the best students. And that's what Jesus says to Matthew sitting at the tax collector booth. Come follow me. And so, of course, he was speechless. I mean, Matthew has decided to go into the Roman-loving, Israel-betraying, cheat anybody as long as it benefits me business. How is he now going to change and go into the rabbi-following business? How is this going to be possible? So I think the crowd looks at him and thinks, what is he going to do? And Matthew simply says this. He got up and he followed Jesus. Well, isn't that amazing? Now, we don't get to hear a lot of the backstory, either from Matthew or any of the other disciples that were called in much the same way. But I want you to know there was a backstory. This was not the first time that Matthew had ever seen Jesus, and it was some kind of weird cult thing. Come follow me. I will follow you, Jesus. Like that. That was not it. There had clearly been a backstory. There had clearly been conversations. Matthew clearly knew that Jesus was at least a great teacher. And so for him to believe in Matthew meant the world. We don't get to hear all of that. But we do get to hear what happened next, which might be even more amazing than that. Look at verse 10. Matthew continues the story with another one-liner. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, let that sink in for a minute, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. So picture this. Come follow me. And so Matthew's now a part of the gang. And he starts thinking, I've got a lot of friends. And just take a wild guess. Do you think Matthew's friends were like him or unlike him? That's not a trick question. Like him, of course. They were sinners and tax collectors too. And he's thinking, okay, I got a lot of these friends, and they like coming to parties. And Jesus likes having conversations with those people. So I've got this great house and a lot of money from my sinful tax collecting days. And so why don't I throw a party? And I can imagine him going to the disciples, the other ones, and trying to pitch this idea. Right? So he goes, maybe it's John or James or Peter. He's like, hey, Pete, I got this idea. I think it's going to be great. I've got these friends, and they like to go to parties. And you know how Jesus likes to have conversations with people? Why don't I throw this big party, and we'll have everybody there? And I think Peter's like, that's a terrible idea. Are you kidding me? We got enough trouble just inviting you to be a part of us. Do you know what they're saying about us? That's a terrible idea. Don't even bring it up again. But Matthew doesn't listen to him, right? And so he goes above him and goes to the Hefe, and he says, hey, Jesus, what about this idea? I throw a party with all my friends, and you come, and you have those conversations like you do. And Jesus looks at him and goes, that's brilliant. Let's do it. And so they have this, the invitation list is a bunch of people, and they show up at this party, and can I tell you, to say that they are the least likely people ever to be having a dinner party with a rabbi is the understatement of the year. And here they are, Jesus at a party with sinners. That's a picture of the church. That's a picture of the church. Now, I can imagine some of the conversations that were taking place there because of what I do. I'm in those conversations sometimes. Like when people find out that I work for a church, or I used to do youth ministry, and I loved it when I would show up at a school and nobody knew who I was yet because they wouldn't change their actions or their language, But as soon as they found out who you were, they were, oh, sorry, like that. And that still happens to me. Elizabeth and I were on vacation with some friends a couple of years ago, and we were going to be there, and they told us, they had some other friends from another part of the country that were going to be with us all week, and they said, hey, we're not going to tell them that you're a pastor because it'll weird them out. And I was fine with that, honestly. We were going on vacation. What do I care? And so we're there on vacation, and how should I put this? She just cussed like a sailor. and it was actually almost comical. And so somewhere around day 3 of the trip, somebody let it slip that I was a pastor. And can I tell you the look on her face? And he's a what? And you could see her mind was replaying all the conversations that we had. And so I see so there's this party going on, and I know that this is happening. There's language, and they go, oh, sorry, Rabbi. I guarantee you that's happening. And Matthew is sitting there smiling from ear to ear because he knows my life will never be the same. Look, and it wasn't. Look, for goodness sakes, he wrote the first book of the New Testament. Matthew, the tax collector guy, for everybody to read about. Changed his life. Now, it's not just the story of Matthew. It's actually the story of everybody. But not everybody was excited about the party, right? If we kept reading, Matthew tells us about the other perspective. In verse 11, he writes, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And it's interesting. They don't ask Jesus, they ask the disciples. But Jesus hears the question and raises his hands. Oh, I know this one. Let me answer. I want to be very clear. I want to tell you the answer to why I do this. I want to make it abundantly clear to you. I want to tell you why I've come, because it's not why you think I've come. And it's not why you tell people I've come. And so Jesus answers the question, verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Everybody's nodding. Sure. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. These two terms that Jesus uses at the end, righteous and sinners, very, very interesting terms. One, because elsewhere Jesus, and later on the Apostle Paul, says there's no one righteous. Don't call anybody righteous, because that's inaccurate. So interesting that Jesus picks this term, but he knows that the people that he's answering the question of, the religious leaders of the day, they divide people into these two categories, righteous and sinners. Which one do you think they put themselves in? Righteous. And Jesus uses their terms to answer their question. Now, look, we all do that. On some level, everyone has a propensity to divide the world into us and them. That's not a religious thing even. That's just a thing. It's a sociological thing, and there's lots of studies of how people in one group will attach negative ideas and character traits to people in the other group. There's a famous study, maybe you remember it from sociology class or something, where they divide these boys into two groups, and they divided them by a coin flip. I mean, you couldn't get any more random division of the two groups of boys. And it turns out that it didn't take very long for the boys in one group to decide that they were actually smarter and stronger than the boys in the other group. And some of you, that doesn't surprise you at all, because you're not a boy. And you're a woman, and you go, that's exactly what boys are like. Girls are worse. Girls are worse. And I say that not because there's been any study, but because I'm a boy. And we all do this, right? And I'm poking a little fun right now because this is going to hit maybe a nerve that's sometimes tough to talk about. That the woman in the drama has a lot of resemblance to the inside of me. Maybe not the part that I let you see or that you let me see, but on some level, a lot of us feel like we're outsiders in different arenas in our lives. And I was trying to think about how to describe this feeling, and this is the best I came up with. The other night, I was driving home, and I live off of 140, and they're doing some construction on the part right before the turnoff to our house, and so they close a lane, each day, and you're not sure which lane is going to be closed, and so I picked the wrong lane. And so so I know my lane is going to end, and I've got to somehow find someone, with a good heart in this other lane to let me in. And so, I'm getting closer and closer to the ending, and where there's, you can't go any farther. And so I kind of give this person a look in the lane next. You've been there, right? And so, I know I'm in the wrong lane. Your lane is great. My lane is bad. Could you see it in the kindness of your heart to, let me into the good lane? And so I just kind of gave him a little, like that. And the guy, he makes this gesture like, oh, please, come on over. I would love for you to come into my lane. It would be my pleasure. It's like Chick-fil-A. My pleasure for you to come into my lane. And so, I felt so warm and affirmed, and I come into his lane. It was great. And the next night, I was coming home a little bit later, and they had it reversed. And now I was in the right lane, right? And so I'm going down there, and I'm feeling good about myself because I was in the right lane. And, same deal. So it's coming down, and somebody kind of looks over me, gives me the eyebrows. I shot right in front of him. And, I thought, yeah, old habits die hard. I was in a hurry. But I still felt warmly about the guy who invited me in to the night before. What's the point of that story? Pray for me no, that's not the point of the story. Here's the point. I am making a little bit of fun because it feels lousy to be in the wrong lane and to feel like everybody else has a lane and I can't get in. Do you know that feeling? See, I think a lot of us do, and a lot of us feel like we're the only ones that feel like an outsider, whether it's outside of our family or outside of the mainstream, whatever that means, or outside of the majority, or outside of a friendship, or outside of love. Can I tell you, Jesus says, that's why I've come. That's why I've come, for people who are outsiders. And don't you know that even those of us who are insiders in one lane feel like outsiders at some point in some lane? And maybe you feel like an outsider all the time in every lane. And I get that. And I want you to know you're not the only one. You're not alone. And most of us feel that. You know, in my job, sometimes people share very personal stuff with me. And I can't tell you how many times it has a theme of, I just feel like an outsider. I feel like a weirdo. I feel like I'm the only person. Whether it's the parents with the pregnant teenager who think, what did we do? How can we move on? Or it's the spouse who was left, abandoned, and they think, this makes me just so weird. And I feel like an outsider every time I come into a group. And I wonder if people are looking at me thinking, oh, and they'll be sorry for me. Or maybe it's the person with a chronic illness who just thinks, sure, they know, but they would rather I didn't bring it up again. People are probably tired of hearing my story, and they feel like an outsider. Or the person who's dealing with grief who just says, I can't smile and pretend like everything's okay when it's not. I don't know every story in the room, but I know enough about our stories to know that so many of us can feel like an outsider. And here's what I have to tell you. You're not alone. You're not a weirdo. So many times we feel like we're in the wrong lane and we can't get in. Now, I don't know how we got there. There's lots of ways, right? Maybe you did something that made you feel like an outsider. Maybe it's a shameful secret that nobody knows. But maybe it's just you got older and less productive. Or maybe it happened a long time ago. Maybe it happened in the middle school lunchroom where somebody told you your hair was too frizzy, your nose was too big, your face was too pimply, or you stuttered too much. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the feeling came from. If you can relate to this, I have great news. Jesus said, that's why I'm here. That is why I'm here. And more than that, the whole Bible, from start to finish, is the story of God pursuing outsiders, foreigners, strangers. I go to page 2. That's page 3. Page 2. The first set of outsiders were Adam and Eve. And you know the compelling part of their story to me is not that they messed up. I totally get that. I could teach that class. What's compelling to me is that God's response to their mess up was not to shun them or shame them or lock them out. Yes, it ended up that they were outside of the garden because of what they chose. But how did God respond? Did he lock the gate and go, no, 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 no? That's the way he's portrayed sometimes. It's not what he does. He moves towards them. And he does two things. First, he covers them. He covers their shame. He doesn't reveal it. He covers it. That's what love does. Love covers, right? And then he goes into redemption and restoration mode. He devises a plan and makes a promise that I will not leave you by yourself. I will not leave you outside. I will create a redeemer. I will become your redeemer outside so that you can come back in. And so it should surprise no one when Jesus shows up on the planet that he shows up as an outsider. And everything he does centers around outsiders. He was born an outsider. Remember the whole stable thing? Shepherds, the whole thing. And then he calls his closest followers, and they're all outsiders. They're all people that didn't get chosen. Exhibit A, Matthew. And then his teaching and his miracles are all focused on outsiders. The last conversation that he has before dying on a cross is with an outsider, hanging on a cross, of a thief. The whole thing is this one giant pursuit of people like you and me. People who sometimes feel like we're outsiders. It's almost like Jesus says, I am going to cast this vision if it kills me. And it kills him. And in that is not just the story of Matthew. It's not just the story of everybody. It's the story of you. That's your story. That Jesus came demonstrates God's love for us. How far he went demonstrates how much. And he went as far as you can go. Now, I wanted to, at the end of this message, try to make it incredibly personal for everyone in the room. And so I want to read you just a quick passage from a deep and great theological treatise called The Runaway Bunny. You've heard of that? It's right up there with Goodnight Moon on the bestseller list for little kids. It's a story of a bunny. I think we have a cover picture. Remember that? When you're a little kid or a parent or a grandparent? It's about a bunny who runs away. And the first page says, once there was a little bunny who wanted to run away. So he said to his mother, I'm running away. If you run away, his mother said, I'll run after you because you're my little bunny. Turn the page. The bunny tells his mother that if she runs after him, he will turn into a fish and swim away from her. Turn the page. She answers by saying if he turns into a fish in a stream, she will become a fisherman and fish for him. Turn the page. 2-page spread of the mother fly fishing with a carrot. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Do you see where this story's going? At every turn, whatever the little bunny says he's going to do to get away, the mom says, I'm committed to becoming whatever I need to become in order to find you. You become a rock on a high mountain, she becomes a climber to come and find him. He becomes a flower hidden in a garden, she becomes a gardener to come find him. And on it goes. You fast forward to the end of the book, and the little bunny sees the reality of his mother's love, and he says this, I might as well stay here and be your little bunny. And then the last page says, and so he did. Have a carrot, said the mother bunny. I think that's uproariously funny. Here, I had this for you the whole time. I was just waiting to give it to you. That's your story. Some of you have felt like God's been pursuing you for decades. You know, there's lots of ways that people over the years have written about the way that feels. So a famous old poem called The Hound of Heaven, it says, God's like a hound. He's got your scent. And he's just after you. Another writer, Anne Lamott, said, God's not like a hound. It's like a little cat that just stays outside your door and won't go away. And you know you better not open the door, because if you do, that thing is there forever. It's going to sleep with you, lick your face in the morning, and all that. Others have said it's like this invitation that keeps coming and coming and coming. I don't know what it is for you, but I know that this is your story. And I know that if you feel like an outsider, God wants you to know this morning, that's why I'm here. That's why the church exists. That's what this morning is for. It's for you and me. For you to maybe say, well, why don't I just stay here? Why don't I stop running? Why don't I stop feeling like an outsider and be brought in? Especially if you think you're the least likely, this is the message for you. Now, I'm not making this up. This didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. This happens in people's lives today in our church. And I'm going to invite the band to come back up, and as they do, I want you to meet a few of those people. So take a look at the side screens.
We both grew up in non-Christian households where church was never really talked about.
And in high school, we found Young Life and started our relationships with Christ.
From there, we came to Crossroads, and we brought our families with us that are now regulars.
And our families are people we never thought would ever go to church, and now they're with us on our journey.
I used to run from God. I always thought I was in trouble. But then I realized He loves me, and He wants me to be in a personal relationship with Him. And I thank Him every day for that.
25 years ago, I retired from the Army thinking I was going to get into the computer field. Today, using many new gifts provided by God, I am working within the church to get the message out to the world.
6 years ago, I was lost, broken, and suicidal. But then I went to a Christian retreat and saw the joy in the body of Christ, and I myself had an encounter with Jesus.
I grew up in the church but fell away for a number of years. A couple years ago, Crossroads had a spontaneous baptism. A friend of mine went forward and was baptized, and that was super powerful for me in the way I encountered Christ.
A couple years ago, I was lost and without a purpose. Then my life changed when my friend invited me to watch him preach. It was then that I found Christ.
I am Sarah, and I've been here 2 years. I tried out churches, and I really like this one.
About 6 or 7 years ago, I found myself losing my faith and disengaging with the Catholic Church. Recently, at the encouragement of my friends and neighbors, they suggested I come to Crossroads Community Church. I find that I'm engaging with Christ again.
And the stories can go on, but maybe this morning is your story. And so as we sing this last song that says, just come as you are, I want to suggest that maybe this is your time to come and to say, God, I'm finished running. I'm finished being an outsider. I want to stay home. I want to stay. I'm yours. And you can do that during this song. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing together. Father, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to hear your heart in such a profound way for people like me, for people who feel like we're outsiders. And I thank you that you are as real here today as you were with Matthew on the day that you called him. And come follow me is an invitation for everyone in the room. We prayed in Jesus' name. Amen.